In 2012, the harbor of Kodiak, Alaska, kept its rituals steady. Boats left at dawn, nets lowered in silence, radios checked before the evening weather rolled in. The Northern Gale did the same, its 5 crewmen expected back before nightfall. At 9:15 p.m., the vessel gave a final call. Then, nothing. Days later, its nets drifted ashore, torn and empty, as though stripped of purpose. Families gathered at the pier, forced to accept memorials instead of answers. But one sister refused, keeping every Coast Guard letter, every search report, every unanswered call log pinned to her kitchen wall. Years passed. Then came a message from across the water. One crewman had survived, carrying with him an artifact the families thought was lost. A testimony waited that would reorder the entire case. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from today, and if you want more stories like this, don't forget to subscribe. Kodiak Harbor moved in rhythm with the sea. Engines turned over before dawn. Hulls creaked against pilings, and diesel fumes hung above the water until the tide carried them away. That year, 2012, no one expected anything different. The Northern Gale was a 40-foot fishing boat painted in fading blue, its name stenciled twice on the bow. Captain Leon Mercer had signed the departure log at the harbor office on a cool September evening. With him were Elias Cade, the Pell brothers' childhood friend Jonah, and the twins Mark and Matthew Rule. They loaded bait, ice, and netting under halogen lamps that lit the dock like a surgical ward. The harbor master noted their departure at 6:45 p.m., recorded in ink and initialed. By 9:15 p.m., a short transmission reached the Coast Guard station. A burst of static first, then Mercer's clipped voice confirming position east of Marmot Bay. Weather steady, nets lowered. No issues. The officer on duty, Ensign Weller, marked the log with a single line. Northern Gale routine check. Nothing more. The shoreline quieted after the transmission. By midnight, the boat should have been within radio range of returning vessels, but no signal followed. At 4 a.m., other crews began docking, unloading halibut and salmon, tallying weights against their manifests. The Northern Gale was not among them. On the pier, unnoticed, a small notebook wrapped in oilcloth remained wedged under a coil of line. It belonged to Jonah Pell. He kept it to track catches, note weather patterns, and sketch repairs for the nets. The oilcloth covering was worn, edges stiff with brine. That night, it had been left behind in haste. When dock workers found it hours later, the first page showed fresh graphite marks, date, crew names, and a reminder to replace the starboard buoy light. No closing entry, no line confirming return. The final notation ended halfway across the page, pencil pressure broken by interruption. The harbor office logged the missing vessel at 10 a.m. when calls from families began arriving. A wife trying to reach her husband's phone. A sister counting hours between unanswered rings. By protocol, no distress call meant no immediate action. The Coast Guard marked it as delayed return, but the log's ink grew heavier with every passing hour. The sea that morning remained calm, sunlight bouncing in fractured mirrors across the bay. Still, the dock smelled of diesel and unfinished work. Nets hung to dry with water dripping in steady rhythm. Normalcy persisted, but one vessel had not followed the pattern. By dusk, concern shifted to unease. No visual sighting, no updated transmission. The Northern Gale was absent from its berth, and the only evidence of its departure was a routine line in the maritime log and a notebook left behind. The harbor master signed off duty at 8 p.m., initialing the ledger once more. Beneath the entry, an empty space remained for the boat's return confirmation. The line was never filled. The nets came back, but the men did not. Claire Pell began her morning routine with silence. She called her brother Jonah's phone at 7 a.m., expecting the usual brief update. Docked, tired, see you tonight. Instead, she heard nothing but a hollow click, followed by the automated voice repeating that the subscriber was out of range. She dialed again at 9, then at 11. Each attempt logged in her phone's call history, time-stamped in sequence. 9:12 a.m., 11:37 a.m., 2:04 p.m. The list became a ledger of unanswered signals. She kept the phone on the kitchen counter, its screen glowing faintly in the dim light. By mid-afternoon, rumors circulated across Kodiak Harbor. The Northern Gale had not docked, its slip still empty. Families began gathering, wives and parents standing in small clusters, coats zipped against the wind. Conversations carried fragments, weather reports, tide charts, excuses for delay, but no confirmation. The absence grew heavier with each hour. The harbor master confirmed what everyone already feared. He checked the maritime manifest once more. Captain Leon Mercer signed out 5 names at departure, 6:45 p.m. No return signature. The office file showed a missing gap, an unclosed transaction. Protocol required notifying the Coast Guard after 12 hours overdue. That clock had already run out. Claire walked the length of the pier, her boots striking wood with a hollow echo. She saw a notebook lying on the counter of the harbor office, bagged and labeled. Jonah's oilcloth journal. The clerk explained it had been found near a coil of line the morning after the boat sailed. Claire asked to hold it. The request was denied. Chain of custody. Evidence could not be released. At home, Claire pulled open a drawer and retrieved another book. Jonah's old journal from their teenage years, one he had left behind when moving into the crew quarters years before. Its pages contained sketches of nets, crude diagrams of tides, and notes about gear repairs. The 2 books looked nearly identical, both wrapped in stiff oilcloth, both carrying the imprint of habit. Claire set the old journal on her kitchen table beside her phone. Together they became her vigil, one object linked to past certainty, the other to present silence. Relatives of the other crew members began arriving at the harbor office. The ruled twins' father demanded updates, his voice carrying down the hallway. Elias Cade's mother stood in the corner, gripping a scarf between her hands, its threads unraveling from friction. The Mercer family leaned against the wall, resigned but waiting. The Coast Guard officer on duty explained the standard procedure. Search and rescue grids would be drawn based on last known coordinates from 9:15 p.m. Aircraft would be deployed at first light. Until then, there was nothing more to say. The words carried no comfort. That night, Claire returned to the harbor once more. She stood at the edge of the pier where the Northern Gale had departed. The tide slapped softly against pilings. Overhead lights buzzed with insects, throwing pale circles on the boards. She imagined Jonah leaning against the railing, journal in his pocket, ready for another long night at sea. Instead, the only record left behind was a page in a logbook and a phone filled with unanswered calls. Salt-stained pages bore no final entry. At 6 a.m., the first Coast Guard helicopter lifted off from the Kodiak airfield. The flight plan traced a grid southeast toward Marmot Bay, each square covering miles of open water. The SAR crew carried binoculars, digital cameras, and evidence tags. Every sighting had to be logged, every anomaly photographed, every object entered into custody. By mid-morning, the search produced debris, a length of trawl netting twisted in a coil, its floats intact but mesh torn clean through. The fragments floated 3 miles east of Spruce Island, drifting against the current. The crew hoisted the net onto the deck of a patrol vessel. Fibers were bagged, labeled with GPS coordinates, and sealed. Chain of custody began not on land but on rolling water. Families were summoned to the harbor to view what had been recovered. Claire arrived first, her hair plastered to her forehead by wind. The Coast Guard officer placed the torn net across a steel table under fluorescent lights. Each float bore paint markings identifying it as property of the Northern Gale. The initials LM, Leon Mercer, were stenciled faintly along the lead line. The room smelled of salt and algae. Relatives leaned close, hoping for hidden meaning in the wreckage. But no one recognized anything beyond ruin. The net was stripped of fish, stripped of function. It had returned without its crew. At 2:30 p.m., another recovery report arrived. A life jacket, orange nylon faded from years of use, found drifting 30 miles north. It bore no name tag, no blood, no tears, just salt crust along the seams. It was logged, sealed, and placed beside the net. Investigators compared drift data with the last radio coordinates from 9:15 p.m. The current analysis suggested the Northern Gale had likely capsized between Marmot Bay and Whale Pass. But no hull had surfaced, no mayday had been recorded. The discrepancy unsettled even seasoned officers. Back at Claire's home, she opened Jonah's old oilcloth journal again. She compared its clean pages to the torn fibers the Coast Guard described. The thought pressed itself. Had Jonah written something in the missing book before it vanished? The lack of a closing entry hung heavier with each hour. That evening, families gathered for an informal meeting at the community hall. Charts were spread across folding tables. Coast Guard staff explained grid patterns with red grease pencil, circling areas already searched. Volunteers offered fishing boats to extend the sweep. Every name was written on a sign-in sheet, each offer logged as evidence of effort. As light faded, another object was reported. A torn scrap of oilcloth, stiff and waterlogged, tangled inside the net fragments. Its fibers matched the same material Jonah used to wrap his journal. Investigators bagged it separately, label-coded CG12458. It was placed into storage beside the jacket, beside the net, forming a line of objects with no men attached. Claire stared at the evidence photos later that night. The scrap of oilcloth resembled the corner of a page cover, edges frayed into threads. She pressed her fingers against the printed image, searching for handwriting too faint to see. Fibers clung to torn netting like fingerprints on glass. The following week, official statements hardened into presumption. Without a mayday signal, without hull recovery, the Northern Gale and its crew were classified lost at sea. The phrase carried bureaucratic weight, appearing in Coast Guard dispatches and local newspapers, repeated with grim efficiency. A memorial service was arranged at the small white church near the harbor. 5 candles burned at the front, their wax pooling unevenly on silver trays. Photographs of Captain Leon Mercer, Elias Cade, Jonah Pell, and the Rule twins leaned against the altar rail. Families sat in silence, the air heavy with the scent of wet coats. The officiant read scripture. The congregation nodded in ritual, but some faces stayed fixed, unaccepting. Claire Pell did not bow her head. She kept her brother's old oilcloth journal on her lap, hands tight around it. When the hymn ended, she left before the benediction, stepping out into drizzle. At home, she placed the journal beside her phone and spread the Coast Guard correspondence across her kitchen table. Each letter was headed with seals and reference codes, each line typed in neutral language. Search area completed. No further assets available. Case considered closed. Claire wrote responses in pen, demanding continuation. She mailed copies to Anchorage and Washington. Her handwriting filled envelopes that would become part of a paper trail, though no one promised acknowledgement. When replies did arrive, they repeated protocol, citing insufficient evidence to sustain further deployment. The community hall hosted a public meeting 3 weeks after the memorial. Attendance thinned. Interest had waned. Only immediate relatives remained, faces drawn from exhaustion. A Coast Guard liaison distributed the final report. 34 pages, bound with metal fasteners, each page initialed. It documented every sortie, every recovered object, every failed lead. The last section concluded, probability of survival, 0. Claire flipped through the pages until she reached Appendix C, Inventory of Recovered Items. Line 3, Fragment, oilcloth, water damaged, illegible. She underlined the words with her fingernail. The report was copied and stored in family homes. Parents folded it into drawers with other lost documents. Spouses filed it beside insurance claims. But Claire taped hers to the kitchen wall above Jonah's old journal. The 2 artifacts, government report and personal notebook, formed a shrine that refused closure. On the pier, fishermen whispered resignation. The sea had taken its due. Nets tore, storms rose without warning, and sometimes men did not come back. No one challenged the narrative, but paperwork carried its own silence. On the Coast Guard Form 4180, section labeled Disposition of Remains, a single box remained blank. No body recovered, no line checked, no closure recorded. The omission glared at Claire each time she studied the copy. Declared lost, but paperwork left an empty box unchecked. 2 months passed before new evidence surfaced. A Japanese longliner en route from the Aleutians reported an unusual object drifting alongside its hull. At 7:20 a.m., the crew hooked it aboard. A white fiberglass fish crate stenciled in fading blue. The words Northern Gale visible under salt stains. Inside the crate, among slime and seaweed, lay a torn scrap of canvas and a strip of cloth knotted tight. When opened, the cloth revealed a faint reddish smear dried into the fibers. The captain logged the find in the vessel's journal and radioed it to the Coast Guard. At 4 p.m., the crate and its contents were transferred at Dutch Harbor to American custody. Laboratory testing began within days. The smear yielded degraded human DNA. Analysts compared the sample against reference swabs voluntarily provided by the Pell family. A partial match confirmed relation to Jonah Pell. The report listed probability of identity at 98.4%, signed by technician initials and filed under case number CG12458B. The crate itself told another story. Scratches along the inner surface suggested contact with metal. Barnacle growth patterns indicated it had been adrift at least 6 weeks. Salt crystallization along the corners confirmed prolonged exposure. Every detail was entered into photographs, measured, cataloged. The item was stored in Anchorage under sealed evidence conditions. When officials delivered the news, families assembled once more in the community hall. The crate was not displayed, but the photographs were passed around under fluorescent light. Faces studied the images with careful silence. Some saw confirmation of death. Others, including Claire, saw proof of struggle. The most disturbing feature lay on the torn scrap bundled with the crate. Under magnification, faint graphite lines appeared. Numbers, notations of latitude and longitude written hastily, incomplete. Analysts enhanced the markings digitally, revealing a coordinate range that fell outside the original search grid. Investigators logged it as inconclusive, origin uncertain. For Claire, it was enough. She traced the coordinates onto a chart pinned above her kitchen table. The point marked a stretch of water 30 miles beyond the Coast Guard's designated area. She circled it in red ink, pinning the page beside Jonah's old oilcloth journal. Other families accepted the report with resignation. The crate and the DNA sample were, to them, the final confirmation. Jonah had died at sea. His remains never recovered. Insurance claims could proceed. Estates could close. The community shifted toward closure. But Claire wrote another letter, attaching copies of the DNA report and the coordinate enhancement. She argued the case could not be closed until the marked location was searched. She mailed the packet by certified post, receipt stapled to her wall. Late one night, she opened Jonah's old journal again. On its last used page, beside notes about net repairs, she penciled the coordinate range herself. The handwriting was hers, but the numbers were his. She underlined them twice. Dried blood mapped a coordinate no chart had marked. The coordinates changed everything. Coast Guard Command authorized a secondary search, citing newly surfaced material evidence. At 5 a.m., 2 cutters and a dive team deployed toward the plotted range. Weather held steady, seas glassy under a gray horizon. The operation log opened with timestamps, asset numbers, crew rosters. Every entry marked in block ink, initialed by supervising officers. At 11:40 a.m., sonar scans picked up a solid mass on the seabed, 70 feet down. Divers descended in pairs, helmets wired to the surface vessel by comms cables. Visibility was poor. Sediment drifted in clouds, obscuring outlines until floodlights revealed the unmistakable shape. A hull inverted, resting on sand. The Northern Gale had been found. Divers documented damage with waterproof cameras. Starboard rail bent inward, wheelhouse collapsed, window shattered. No bodies visible in first sweep. They secured access lines and began systematic entry. Inside, the galley was overturned, utensils scattered across linoleum. In the cabin, lockers hung open. Contents spilled into corners. No life jackets remained. The wheelhouse yielded something else. Wedged between a bulkhead and collapsed panel lay an object wrapped in oilcloth, swollen with water. A diver eased it free, bagged it, and signaled ascent. On the surface, it was logged immediately, photographed, and sealed. Once dried under controlled conditions, it revealed itself as Jonah Pell's missing journal. The pages were warped, many stuck together. Technicians used humidification to separate them. Handwriting emerged in faint graphite strokes. Daily notations tracked catches, weather, and positions until the night of disappearance. The last page was torn across the center, pencil halted mid-stroke. Inside the log, analysts also discovered granular residue. Under microscope, it proved to be rust flakes consistent with hull abrasion. Fibers clung to the binding, identical to those recovered from the torn net. Chain of custody linked them into a single forensic line: net fragment, cloth scrap, hull wreck, journal. Families were called to Anchorage for briefing. Claire sat in the front row as evidence photos were projected onto a screen. She saw her brother's handwriting, the unfinished line cutting into damp paper. The investigator explained no further entries were made. "Likely interrupted during capsize," he said, voice measured. Claire requested to view the journal itself. The request was denied. The object was to remain in custody until analysis completed. Instead, she was given a photograph of the last page. A jagged tear sliced through graphite lines. Half a word lingered, unfinished. The discovery shifted classification of the case. Official reports now read, "Hull located, wreck confirmed. Crew status presumed deceased." Yet no remains had been recovered. The line marked "Disposition of Remains" remained blank on updated forms. That night, Claire pinned the photograph of Jonah's last page beside her coordinate map. The oilcloth journal had returned, but incomplete. A single page clung stubbornly inside the wreck, torn but preserved, refusing final closure. Inside the hull, one torn page clung to rust. Evidence transfer occurred under strict protocol. Jonah Pell's recovered journal was sealed in a polypropylene case, transported to Anchorage's forensic archive, and logged into the evidence custody sheet as item CG12691. Every handling required initials. Every inspection required timestamp. Claire was granted permission to attend the formal presentation for families. The session convened in a windowless briefing room at Coast Guard headquarters. A projector displayed high-resolution scans of the journal pages, projected against white walls scarred by pinholes from past cases. Analysts explained their findings. Most entries routine, detailing catch counts and equipment repairs. But the final surviving page drew attention. Written in Jonah's cramped pencil strokes, a single word occupied the lower half: "Wait." Nothing followed. The graphite line ended abruptly at the page tear, as if broken off mid-motion. Handwriting comparison confirmed authenticity. The report displayed overlay analysis, angles of pressure, line weights, letter formation, matching earlier pages. The examiners concluded no indication of forgery. The word was Jonah's. The context was absent. Claire studied the projection without speaking. She recognized the tilt of the W, the uneven spacing between A and I. She remembered identical quirks in his old journals from childhood. Seeing them here felt less like comfort than intrusion. The room sat in silence as the chain of custody officer held up the sealed case containing the actual journal. Families were not permitted to touch it. The object remained behind plexiglass, tagged with barcodes, illuminated under harsh fluorescent light. After the session, Claire approached the evidence officer privately. She requested a physical copy of the last page. Policy forbade it. Instead, the officer allowed her to view the actual paper for less than a minute, gloved hand turning it carefully. She leaned close, inhaling the faint smell of rust and mildew. The torn edge looked jagged, like ripped fabric. That evening, back home, Claire placed the photograph of the word "wait" into Jonah's older journal, aligning it with blank paper. She clipped it there with a rusted paper clip. The old and new bound together, two artifacts separated by years, united by handwriting that ended without explanation. Her kitchen wall had become an archive. Coast Guard reports, coordinate charts, photographs of net fragments. And now Jonah's final word. Every document pinned in straight lines, each item cataloged in her own system. Visitors called it obsession. Claire called it evidence. The official report concluded with clinical brevity. Recovered journal indicates final conscious entry by crew member Pell, meaning undetermined. That single sentence reduced her brother's last message to ambiguity. But ambiguity carried weight. The word, bagged and tagged, was now part of the official record, preserved indefinitely in federal storage. No one could erase it. One word, bagged, tagged, and left unanswered. 6 months after the hull's discovery, routine patrol reports yielded an anomaly. A Russian trawler, the Vostok Star, transmitted an urgent message while operating in the Bering Sea. At dawn, crewmen had spotted a small figure adrift on a crude raft made of lashed timbers. When hauled aboard, the survivor was near death, dehydrated, salt-burned, and barely conscious. Passport checks identified him not as a foreigner but as Alaskan. The Coast Guard confirmed through dental and fingerprint records. Elias Cade, deckhand of the Northern Gale, missing since 2012. At 9:20 a.m., EMS intake forms were opened in Anchorage. Elias's vitals were recorded. Core temperature dangerously low, skin abraded, lungs raspy with fluid. Nurses clipped monitors to his chest and logged every reading. IV saline dripped through clear tubing, time-stamped on charts. His survival defied medical expectation. When conscious hours later, Elias whispered fragments. Storm, flipped, others. His voice rasped into incoherence. Doctors noted delirium, probable trauma, yet his name, date of birth, and vessel matched. Personal effects were few, but one item caught attention. Wrapped tight around his left hand was a strip of oilcloth, darkened by salt. It had been knotted so tightly that skin beneath was raw. Investigators pried it loose and bagged it. Inside was a damp scrap of paper, smeared with graphite. Under laboratory enhancement, the lines resembled half-formed letters, too eroded to read. Still, it linked directly to the journal found inside the wreck. Chain of custody tied the artifacts together, a continuum from disappearance to survival. Families were notified by phone at 11 p.m. Claire Pell answered on the first ring. The Coast Guard officer's voice was formal, detached. A survivor has been located, identity confirmed as Elias Cade. Claire's hand froze on the receiver. For months, she had stared at Jonah's word, wait. Now the word had acquired weight. Someone had waited and lived. News spread across Kodiak by morning. Harbor workers exchanged murmurs. Shop owners pinned fresh articles to bulletin boards. For the first time since the disappearance, the town shifted from mourning to anticipation. At the hospital, Elias lay under thin blankets, his skin cracked from salt exposure. When asked about the oilcloth he clutched, he simply repeated, "It was his." Pressed further, he whispered a name, Jonah, and then drifted into sleep. Nurses documented every word in clinical ink. Rescued at dawn, clutching cloth like scripture. The interview room was small, walls painted in sterile beige, microphones fixed to the ceiling. A Coast Guard investigator sat across from Elias Cade, who wore hospital scrubs, his skin still mottled from exposure. A recorder light blinked red. The transcript began at 10:12 a.m. Elias spoke haltingly, voice raspy. He described the storm. Sudden wind shift, nets straining, hull tilting. Captain Mercer ordered them to cut lines, but before knives cleared the rope, a wave struck broadside. The Northern Gale capsized in seconds. According to Elias, he and Jonah clung to the starboard rail as water surged into the wheelhouse. Mark and Matthew Rule were swept overboard almost instantly. Captain Mercer disappeared beneath the overturned deck. Jonah shouted something. Elias thought it was weight, before handing him a strip of oilcloth torn from his own journal. Then another surge separated them. Elias drifted alone, finding a shattered hatch cover to use as flotation. Days blurred. He remembered rain, then nothing until Russian fishermen dragged him aboard the Vostok Star. Investigators pressed for details. Did Jonah survive longer? Did Elias see signs of life from others? Elias shook his head. He remembered only fragments. A voice in the dark, pencil scratching against wet paper, then silence. Medical reports documented his condition. Toxicology screens showed extreme dehydration, sodium imbalance, and micro lesions in lung tissue from aspirated seawater. His fingernails were cracked, salt crystals embedded in skin folds. Intake summaries noted remarkable endurance, cause unknown. The oilcloth scrap was logged separately, item CG12784. Chain of custody connected it to the hull journal and the crate fragment. 3 pieces now formed a forensic continuum, evidence of Jonah's final efforts, transferred hand-to-hand to Elias before separation. Claire attended the debriefing. She sat in the corner, listening without speaking, her eyes fixed on the transcript printout. Every word was copied, date stamped, initialed. Elias's testimony transformed rumor into record. Afterward, Claire approached him in the hospital ward. He lay pale, IV still dripping. She held the old journal in her hands, the one Jonah had left behind years earlier, and showed him the photograph of the last page from the wreck. Elias raised his hand weakly, pointing at the word, wait. His eyes filled with recognition. "That's what he told me," he whispered. Nurses logged the exchange in the patient chart. Testimony logged, but faces still unaccounted. With Elias Cade's testimony entered into the record, analysts turned to reconstruction. Coast Guard Command ordered a full drift simulation based on his reported separation point. Oceanographers compiled wind vectors, tide charts, and current speeds from September 2012. Data sets were fed into modeling software, producing animated tracks of debris and human drift potential. The results were stark. Colored lines showed projected movements radiating outward from Marmot Bay. Within 48 hours, 3 of the 5 plotted tracks exited the grid entirely, carried into the Gulf of Alaska, where recovery odds dropped to 0. By the 5th day, the models showed the bodies would have dispersed hundreds of miles offshore, beyond feasible search range. Investigators presented the findings in a sealed report. Pages contained charts annotated with arrows, timestamps, and probability percentages. Every diagram bore signatures of verification, entered into the official file under classification Closed Search, No Further Action. Families gathered for the briefing. The rural parents sat motionless, faces drawn. The Mercers nodded faintly, acknowledging what they already suspected. Claire Pell sat apart, eyes scanning the charts. Her gaze stopped at one overlay. The simulated track for Jonah Pell crossed precisely through the coordinates penciled in the fragment found in the crate. It was not coincidence. The half-finished numbers Jonah scribbled matched the model with disturbing precision. The detail was logged in the report as notable correlation. Analysts admitted Jonah may have anticipated the drift, attempting to record location before the storm consumed the vessel. His handwriting had marked what the software later confirmed. Claire pinned the drift chart beside her growing wall of documents. The red arrows from the simulation lined up with Jonah's graphite scrawl. She underlined them together in black marker. To her, it was proof of intent, not just chance. Elias remained in hospital care, recovering strength. When shown the charts, he nodded slowly. "That's where he thought we'd end up," he said. Nurses noted his response, logged at 3:12 p.m. Despite the clinical certainty of the models, no remains were ever recovered. The line, "Disposition of remains," remained blank on every updated form, an omission that echoed across the paperwork trail. Simulation showed bodies drifting beyond recovery line. The courtroom was austere, its walls paneled in oak, the air heavy with formality. At 9 a.m., proceedings opened to certify the official cause of death for the missing crew of the Northern Gale. Families sat in designated rows, their names checked against the attendance sheet. The docket listed the case as Maritime Casualty Determination, 2012. The prosecution introduced exhibits one by one. Photographs of the torn net, the crate with stenciled name, the oilcloth scraps, the hull recovery images, and finally, the journal. Each item was logged into the record, barcodes scanned, seals checked for tampering. Clerks read aloud the chain of custody sheets, documenting every transfer from ocean recovery to archive storage. Analysts testified with clinical detachment. DNA analysis confirmed blood on the crate as Jonah Pell's. Handwriting experts repeated earlier findings. The final word, wait, was authentic. Oceanographers explained drift simulations, pointing to projected loss zones. Each testimony built a lattice of evidence converging on the conclusion: accidental maritime disaster. When called, Elias Cade walked slowly to the witness stand, supported by a cane. He took the oath and sat, voice low but steady. He recounted the storm, the capsizing, Jonah's final act of handing him the oilcloth scrap. Court stenographers recorded every syllable, keystrokes echoing in the chamber. His words carried no embellishment, only clinical sequence. Wave struck, hull rolled, men swept away. Families listened in silence. Some wiped their eyes. Claire Pell sat forward, her hands clasped around Jonah's old journal, the one not entered into evidence but carried privately. She watched as the sealed federal exhibit, the recovered journal, was displayed to the court under clear plexiglass. It rested on a metal stand, pages fanned, the word "wait" visible on the torn sheet. After deliberation, the court issued its ruling. Cause of death: accidental maritime disaster. Legal presumption: deceased. Certificate forms were prepared for each crewman. The ruling enabled closure in official systems, estates processed, insurance settled, case concluded. Yet silence followed the pronouncement. No gavel strike could erase absence. The courtroom emptied slowly, chairs scraping wood. Exhibits were packed into cases, scanned out of custody, and returned to archive storage. Evidence admitted, silence followed. Spring returned to Kodiak Harbor in slow fragments. Nets dried on lines again, engines rumbled in the morning fog, and new crews signed their names into the harbor log. Life resumed its rhythm, but 5 names remained absent from every ledger. A memorial stone was raised near the pier, granite etched with the crew's names: Captain Leon Mercer, Jonah Pell, Mark, and Matthew Rule. Beside them, Elias Cade's name was omitted. He lived, but his survival cast a shadow neither he nor the town could easily carry. Families laid wreaths each year, the tide washing foam against the seawall beneath the stone. Claire Pell refused to let ritual replace record. She arranged a glass display case in her living room, lined with acid-free paper. Inside, she placed Jonah's recovered journal, returned to the family after the court closed its files. The oilcloth cover was stiff, its stains permanent. Pages warped by salt bore his cramped pencil strokes, culminating in the final torn word. She pinned to the wall above the case the Coast Guard letters, drift simulation charts, and photographs of the wreck. Every piece documented a fragment of absence. Together they formed a private archive, not of mourning, but of proof. Visitors saw obsession. Claire saw preservation. Elias returned to the harbor months later, walking slowly with a cane. He spoke little, working odd jobs away from the boats. In interviews, he repeated the same sequence: storm, capsize, separation. No embellishment. The transcript of his testimony remained the official endpoint. Yet for Claire, the survivor's presence carried a weight more complex than closure. His endurance validated Jonah's final word. Weight had not been empty. It had been a transfer of hope, embodied in the oilcloth scrap Elias clutched across the sea. The Coast Guard archive filed the case under closed accidental loss. Forms were boxed, barcoded, and shelved. But a duplicate of the custody release confirmed the journal had been signed over to the Pell family. Claire framed that document too, placing it beside the case. At dusk, she often sat before the glass, reading the stains and graphite as though they were still alive. Forensic traces had become her inheritance. Ordinary objects rendered permanent evidence. The oilcloth journal closed, its stains forever